Well, hi friends, Father Frank Pavone here, National Director of Priests for Life. Welcome to our pro-life MAGA broadcast. Make America Great Again. We are approaching our midterm elections. Tuesday, November the 6th, and every day we are coming to you live with educational and inspirational broadcasts that are helping you to prepare yourselves and your fellow citizens for this election, to make it a step forward in making America great, keeping America great, making America free and strong, pro-life and pro-family and pro-freedom. And there's many ways that we can do that. There's many ways we need to do that. And in each of these broadcasts, we're looking at a different angle, a different aspect of this important task, which belongs to all of us, whether we are clergy or laity, no matter what denomination we belong to. It's a task for us all, and an urgent one. Tonight, I want to talk to you about the freedom to preach politics, the freedom that the church has, the freedom that every organization has to engage in elections because it's a fundamental right. And I'm going to address very specifically the confusion, the misunderstanding that exists in so many churches about, we're afraid to lose our tax-exempt status if we say anything about elections. I am going to give you some real clarity about this tonight. I'm going to quote from a number of sources, just going to be us talking, so I want you to get comfortable, get out a pen and paper, and follow me closely in what I'm going to say. It's not going to be too hard to understand, but there will be a lot of new information and interesting facts and arguments for you to consider. If you, like me, are a member of the clergy, if you preach the Word of God in a church, you're going to find these comments tonight very freeing, very liberating. If you are part of an organization that is, as we call it, a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, and you're not sure about where that boundary line is, about what you can say about politics and candidates, and can you name names, and what can you do and what can't you do, you're going to know a lot more about that in a little while if you stay with me here and follow what I'm going to say. This is going to be very, very helpful for you. And this is so important so that those clergy and those people in various organizations who want to say something, who are longing to say and do more, but just are not sure where those boundary lines are, this is going to be very liberating. Now, on the other hand, for those that are just afraid to do so and they're looking for excuses, what this is going to show them tonight is that they've got to find a different excuse. They can't blame the tax guy for not being able to speak out about elections. Don't blame the tax guy. Don't blame the government. Don't blame the IRS. If you're just a coward, blame yourself. Okay? Don't try to pin it on somebody else. Oh, they won't let me talk about this. It's not true. You have nobody to blame but yourself. Nobody's muzzling you except you. So we're going to go into why this is true. Let me start. I'm going to both start and finish with a quote from our president, President Donald Trump. And by the way, I sent this out as a fax just the other day to all the Catholic churches in America. We send it to other churches as well. But this is from a talk that he gave in May of 2017 at a ceremony in which he issued an executive order making it clear that the federal government is not going to punish any churches or organizations for speaking their mind about politics. The President of the United States said, the government's not going to punish you. It's not going to take away your tax-exempt status. Let me read his exact words. Then we're going to go into this in much more detail. And then at the end, I'll read his words again, and they're going to make even more sense. Here's the President. No American should be forced to choose between the dictates of the federal government and the tenets of their faith. As I campaigned across the country, faith leaders explained that they are prevented from speaking their minds because of a 1954 rule known as the Johnson Amendment. I spoke about it a lot. Under this rule, if a pastor, priest, or imam speaks about issues of public or political importance, they are threatened with loss of their tax-exempt status, a crippling financial punishment. Very, very unfair, but no longer. This executive order directs the IRS not to unfairly target churches and the religious community for political speech. No one should be censoring sermons or targeting pastors. In America, we do not fear people speaking freely from the pulpit. We embrace it. America has a rich tradition of social change beginning in our pews and pulpits. Under my administration, this free speech does not end at the steps of a cathedral or synagogue or any other house of worship. We are giving our churches their voices back. We are giving them back in the highest form. With this executive order, we make clear that the federal government will never, ever penalize any person for their protected religious beliefs. That is why I am today directing the Department of Justice to develop new rules to ensure these religious protections are afforded to all Americans. You know, at that ceremony in May of 2017, when President Trump spoke those words, we at Priests for Life were represented there by Alveda King, who is our full-time director of Civil Rights for the Unborn, our outreach to the African American community. And she was there for a very specific reason. One of the people that the president referenced in his further remarks was her uncle, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose preaching from the pulpits of America is an excellent example of how the freedom of speaking from those pulpits can transform public policy, can transform America as it did in the civil rights movement. So it is today with the pro-life movement, the pro-family movement, all the movements that you and I value. We need to be able to have the churches speak and act and mobilize and encourage the citizens and empower them, not discourage them and disempower them. Now, in the light of all this, before we go into a detailed background into this Johnson Amendment, let me read for you a quote from the Second Vatican Council, official teaching of the Catholic Church. This is from the document Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, number 76. Listen to what this says, and listen to it in the light of what the President said and the words I just quoted. This is the Vatican Council speaking. At all times and in all places, the Church should have the true freedom to teach the faith, to proclaim its teaching about society, to carry out its task among men without hindrance, and to pass moral judgment even in matters relating to politics, whenever the fundamental rights of man or the salvation of souls requires it. Even in matters relating to politics, the church is not to be silent. And it makes reference to when the fundamental rights of human beings require it. Wow. Or you think we're at a time like that right now? Defending the fundamental right to life? Does the defense of the fundamental right to life require the church to speak out and pass moral judgment in matters relating to politics? Like maybe moral judgments on political parties that take a position that say abortion should be allowed, in fact should be unrestricted, in fact should be paid for by your tax dollars. These are all things that the Democrat Party platform says. So does the fact that the Democrat Party platform says this mean that I can't speak against it? Because then, I'm going to appear to be attacking the Democrats. I'm going to appear to be Republican because, after all, the Republican platform says that there is a right to life and that the child in the womb should be protected. Well, that kind of sounds to me like the teaching of the church also. So if I articulate the teaching of the church, do I sound like a Republican when it comes to the pro-life matters, when it comes to abortion? When I criticize abortion, or when I say that the first duty of government is to protect life, or when I say that these children cannot be killed, does that make me sound like I'm criticizing the Democrat Party? Well, of course we're saying that their position is wrong. Of course we are. Let's not fool ourselves. You can't have a party saying abortion should be legal, a church saying it shouldn't, and then when you're speaking the message of the church, pretend that it's not at odds with the Democrat Party. Of course it is. And what both the church and the state are saying, what both the Second Vatican Council and President Donald Trump are saying, is that we've got to be free to say it. Let's go into a little bit more detail. I'm actually going to read for you a lot of passages from my own book called Abolishing Abortion. Do you have a copy of this book? It was published by Nelson Books back in 2015, before the campaigns of the 2016 presidential race got started. It was published, and in this book, I deal a lot with the Johnson Amendment. And let me tell you why. Because I wrote this book as a manifesto for the pro-life movement. I wanted to write a book that answered the question, what do the church and the state need to do next to bring an end to abortion in America? What are the big obstacles in our way? And what do we need to do to break through those obstacles? Now, I know something about the obstacles that exist in the church. Priests for Life has been around and working within the church on the abortion issue since 1991. I've been the full-time director of this organization since 1993. And in the course of doing our work, we have been very, starting with the election of 1994, very vocal about politics, passing moral judgment on matters relating to politics when the fundamental rights of man require it, like the Second Vatican Council said. And what we've come to find out is that there's a lot of fear in the church. Oh, but you can't talk this way, you're going to lose your tax-exempt status. And sometimes people will complain to the IRS when they hear a group saying something that they think crosses the line. And in fact, we had to go through, for a number of years, an audit from the IRS about our political activity. They asked for all my sermons. They asked for a copy of all my television programs, all our writings, all our press releases, all our articles. They wanted to see all of it. We sent literally boxes and boxes of material over to the IRS. I'll tell you what, somebody over there got a really good education about the abortion issue if they listened to all that stuff. But what they were looking for was, did they in fact cross any lines when it comes to this prohibition on churches and organizations imposed by the Johnson Amendment? We're going to read in a moment more about what that is. And in the end, they didn't have anything to punish us for. After all that, they said, no, we're not going to do anything to your tax-exempt status. We had a major investigation. And here you have people that are worried that one thing that they put in the church bulletin or a sermon that they give about an election is going to, and here's how this kooky thinking goes. They are going to make their church lose its tax exemption, and because the parish is connected with the diocese, the whole diocese will lose its tax exemption, and because the dioceses are connected with the bishops' conference nationally, the whole church in the United States will lose its tax exempt status. You know, did you ever see the bumper sticker, "I break for animals"? Okay, and then somebody did a spin-off of that and made a bumper sticker saying, "I break for hallucinations." Well, that's what this reminds me of. Breaking for hallucinations, not speaking things that obviously need to be spoken in defense of vulnerable children from abortion, not speaking judgments that obviously have to be made on the politics of pro-abortion in our nation, and stopping short of doing that out of the hallucination, and I use that word deliberately, consciously, and I'll repeat it over and over, it's a hallucination that I say something about this on Sunday, and Monday morning, I'm going to get a knock on the door. It's going to be the IRS trying to take away not only my tax-exempt status, but that of the entire Catholic Church in all America. I have seen attorneys, experts. I have spoken with the nation's top experts in this area of the law. We know each other. And I have heard and seen them laugh out loud at these kinds of assertions that unfortunately too many church leaders use. Now, either they are very, very, very uninformed about what the law really is and about what the dangers really are, or they are such cowards that they're looking for all kinds of excuses and they're hiding behind the tax man, like I said before. They really don't want to talk out about abortion. They don't want to offend their Democrat pro-abortion friends. And so they got to find an excuse why not to talk about it. And they hide behind the tax man. And then they try to make the people under their authority feel just as afraid so that there can be an excuse for the silence. We're not buying into any of this, brothers and sisters. It's a load of crap. Let me start to deal with this in some more detail. Let me go back to 1964. There was a Supreme Court case called New York Times Company versus Sullivan. One of my favorite lines from any Supreme Court case is this one. We have a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Isn't that a beautiful description of what our discourse is supposed to be like in America on public issues? After all, public issues, by definition, affect the public. They affect us all. We all have a stake in it, and therefore we should have a say in it. Right? And different people have different ideas. Nobody's got it all figured out in their head. And so we need one another to debate and to get into public issues. Our nation really is healthy when there are multiple political parties and multiple perspectives. But that health is not going to be healthy unless we can speak. If people have various different ideas, and they feel like there's a muzzle over their mouth and they can't share those ideas, America is made less enriched by that. We're impoverished as a result. Our national discourse suffers as a result. It should be debate on public issues, again quoting this Supreme Court case, debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And the court describes this as a principle to which we have a profound national commitment. We have a profound national commitment, and we should have a profound personal commitment. And I will go further and say we should have a profound ecclesial commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, not muzzled, not dissuaded because of fear, but uninhibited, robust, not just hinting at something or giving a little bit of information or a nod and a wink or a clue or, hey, read my mind. No, robust and wide open, not hush, hush over here. Oh, you could talk about it in secret, but not in public. You could talk about it in your private kitchen, but not from the pulpit. Is that what wide open means? I quoted for you from the Second Vatican Council already. Let's look at what this Johnson Amendment actually is. There are various kinds of organizations in the United States that can be created under the law. And one particular type is an educational organization. Now, we at Priests for Life are of this type. Our mission is to educate on the problem of abortion and the solutions to it. So we're called a 501c3. Now, that's just a section of the tax code. The tax code is very, very, very complex and has all these divisions and subdivisions and subsections of subdivisions about what kind of organizations you can have. So section 501c3 is one of the most famous sections because it's the way that most organizations, if you belong to a club or an organization of some kind in your community, it's probably a 501c3. And in fact, your church, as most churches, are organized also under this category in the tax law, a tax-exempt educational organization. Now, we won't go into detail here about the various other distinctions. We could, but we won't right now. And what organizations do, and what we at Priests for Life did when we were first established, is we knock on the door of the IRS and we say, hey, we want to establish ourselves, or we have, actually what you say to them is, we have established ourselves as a 501c3 organization. So we would like you to give us a letter indicating that we are tax exempt. You look at our structure, look at our activities, look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, and then you give us a letter that says, yes, we are tax exempt organization, and then donors to us can write that off as an exemption on their tax returns, etc. But here's an interesting thing. Churches, even though when they organize, now the custom is that they also knock on the door of the IRS and say, oh, would you please give us that letter? They actually don't need it. Let me quote from the federal case called Branch Ministries versus Rosati. Quote, although most organizations seeking tax-exempt status are required to apply to the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, for an advance determination that they meet the requirements of Section 501c3, a church may simply hold itself out as tax-exempt and receive the benefits of that status without applying for advance recognition from the IRS. This is an interesting distinction. You know why? The church existed before the IRS. The church existed before the federal government of the United States existed. Churches in history, not only in American history, but in world history, have always been considered tax exempt. We have evidence going back to the 2800 BC from ancient Sumeria, talking about the tax exemption of the church. So the church is automatically exempt by its nature as a church. It's not because you do or you don't have a letter from the IRS, or the IRS gave you a letter, but then later they revoked it. This is laughable. Obviously, if people think the church loses its tax exemption because the IRS calls up the bishop or sends a letter to the pastor, oh, your tax exemption is revoked. It's just obviously a tremendous ignorance of history to think that that's what it's about. Let's go on. How did this Johnson Amendment come about? 1954. It's not that long ago. 1954. That was 5 years before I was born. Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas was running for re-election. And he had won his Senate seat by a margin of only 87 highly disputed votes. Not 8,700, 87 votes. Now he was up for re-election. He was afraid. There were two secular nonprofit organizations who were supporting not him, but his opponent. He was afraid. So he asked the IRS commissioner to determine whether those organizations might be breaking any laws for their political involvement in advocating for his opponent. They were not breaking any laws. And so what did he do? Without any discussion, without any debate, without any considerations of the constitutionality of it, he introduces an amendment to the tax code. This is why it's called the Johnson Amendment, because Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas introduced it. And he introduced it because he was afraid for his political career, threatened by not-for-profit organizations. Now, not churches, not-for-profit organizations that were in favor of his opponent. And in fact, he got this amendment passed without any formal hearings, but no discussion was held as to whether or not this restriction applied to churches. What the restriction said is that such organizations, tax exempt under 501c3, cannot intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Now, the problem is, it does not define what these words mean. And this is the fundamental problem with the law. So we have a prohibition on intervening in a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. The in opposition, by the way, was added later. That wasn't added until 1987. But it doesn't define these terms. And again, there's no legislative history or debate behind the amendment. And so we don't know what was intended by this. An aide to Johnson, George Reedy, maintained, and I quote, "Johnson would never have sought restrictions on religious organizations." Let me read that again. Johnson's aide, okay, the guy after whom the Johnson Amendment is named, his aide, George Reedy, maintained, quote, "Johnson would never have sought restrictions on religious organizations." So to say this applies to, remember, his political enemies were secular nonprofit organizations. For him to think that this would also apply to churches, it was not discussed, and his aide says, no, he would have never thought that. Interesting perspective. Now, if you and I are under a law, we want to be law-abiding citizens, right? Okay, so if you're going to follow the law, how do you follow a law? How do you make sure that you don't break a certain law? Don't you have to know exactly what that law requires or what that law prohibits? If the law is going to prohibit you from a particular behavior, is going to punish you for doing something, isn't it only right and fair and just that you know what that something is? You have to know where the boundary line is, right? Otherwise, it's not fair. And if it's not fair, it's not constitutional. And this is something called vagueness. In other words, laws get struck down all the time because of vagueness. They don't allow the person who's bound by the law to clearly know when and if their behavior is violating the law. Well, that's one of the weaknesses of the Johnson Amendment, because like I said, the terms are not defined. What does it mean to intervene? What is a political campaign? Who is identified as a candidate? None of those things is defined. In 2008, a study was done on the Johnson Amendment by the Congressional Research Service. And here's what the report said in part. Quote, "The line between what is prohibited and what is permitted can be difficult to discern." Tell me about it. In the IRS training materials, the same report of the Congressional Research Service says this: "In many situations, the activity is permissible unless it is structured or conducted in a way that shows bias towards or against a candidate." Bias. So now, in other words, it's not just if I stand up and say, I endorse John Smith for Congress, or I oppose Betty Smith for re-election. Now that's pretty clear cut. You are taking a stand specifically on a political race, a political candidate. But that's not what this is saying. This is saying the activity is permissible unless it is structured or conducted in a way that shows bias towards or against the candidate, just bias. So it's like, how do I show bias? By saying I don't want them reelected, or by taking a position opposite to the one that they take on a major issue like abortion? Well, Congressional Research Committee goes on to say, some biases can be subtle. Okay, so not only do I not know for sure what constitutes expression of bias, but now I'm being told some of these expressions are subtle. And it goes on to say, whether an activity is campaign intervention will depend on, okay, here it comes, okay, now maybe we're getting some guidance. It will depend on what? The facts and circumstances of each case. End of quote. And again, and again, and again. And even in a way that's admitted by the IRS training materials, these boundaries are vague. What in the world does it mean? Again and again, they say you have to take account of all the facts and circumstances. So I'm trying to take part in public life in America as head of an organization or head of a church, and I'm being told I can't intervene in a political campaign, and I'm being told that I cannot even express bias towards or against a particular candidate or party. And when I ask, well, what are the boundaries of that? When do I know when I've done that? When do I know when I haven't? I'm told, well, it depends on all the facts and circumstances. Well, what in the world does that mean? Tell me what decision in your life depends on all the facts and circumstances. On the one hand, you got to ask yourself, well, facts and, isn't that self-evident? I mean, if it doesn't depend on the facts and circumstances, what does it depend on? Dreams, hallucinations, crystal balls? But then again, if you say, well, it depends on all the facts and circumstances, is there any decision you have ever made in your life for which you know all the facts and circumstances? It's like saying, okay, you did this today, you thought it was the right thing, and 6 months down the road, I'm going to bring to light a fact or a circumstance that you didn't think about at the moment, and I'm going to show that you actually violated the law. I mean, all the facts and circumstances? When do you ever know all the facts and circumstances about anything? A person can be in a position of perpetual fear that they're going to be told that they broke the law. And in fact, that vagueness has put so many pastors and churches and 501c3 organizations, like they don't know which way to turn. They don't know which end is up. And when that's the case, another predictable thing happens. As the court said in a decision called Grayned versus the City of Rockford, quote, uncertain meanings inevitably lead citizens to steer far wider of the unlawful zone than if the boundaries of the forbidden areas were clearly marked. In other words, as was said in another case called Virginia versus Hicks, quote, many persons, rather than undertake the considerable burden and sometimes risk of vindicating their rights by case-by-case litigation, will simply choose to abstain from protected speech, harming not only themselves but society as a whole, which is deprived of an uninhibited marketplace of ideas. Harking back to the 1964 Supreme Court decision, which said that our debate on public matters should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. It's not going to be uninhibited if we're inhibited by the fear that we've crossed a boundary that we don't know where it is. We've crossed a line that's so cloudy and unreachable because it depends on all the facts and circumstances, and nobody ever knows all the facts and circumstances about anything, that then we just shut up. And look what it says. This is the court speaking, not even the church. It says, look, we're all impoverished as a result. How many things could have been said, would have been said in pulpits, in sermons, in articles, in radio broadcasts, in TV shows? How many ideas would have been conveyed had it not been for the fear that that pastor or that speaker had of violating a boundary that they don't know where in the world it is, and nobody else does either. And so they kept silent. This is impoverishing our nation and brothers and sisters and pastors and clergy and priests and deacons and bishops. This is impoverishing our church. We've got to get the muzzle off our mouths once and for all. It's impoverishing our preaching. It's impoverishing our teaching. It's impoverishing the personal conversations we have one to another. It's impoverishing the ability of parishioners to communicate with each other the information about this upcoming election and the voter guides and all of that. They can't even feel like they can have a conversation with somebody on church property lest the police are going to be called on them. This has got to stop. There's no reason for it, especially nowadays in this current climate, when we've got the kind of president that we have that knows enough about what the law says and that cares enough about our freedom. He believes in the freedom of the church. He believes in the freedom of you and the freedom of me to speak our mind on these issues. So the court has over again and again, including in its 2010 decision called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, has rejected this idea of a complex, vague, confusing system of restrictions on political speech. And let me quote here from Citizens United, this 2010 decision. Again, this is the Supreme Court speaking. Applying this standard would require case-by-case determinations. But archetypal political speech would be chilled in the meantime. That's the point I was just making, right? First Amendment freedoms need breathing space to survive. We decline to adopt an interpretation that requires intricate case-by-case determinations to verify whether political speech is banned. By the way, they were talking about the political speech of corporations. Can corporations fund political speech? Is that an aspect of free speech? And the court said, of course it is. So then they go on to say, when the Federal Election Commission issues advisory opinions that prohibit speech, many persons, rather than undertake the considerable burden, this is the quote we made before, rather than undertaking the risk of litigation, they're just going to abstain from the speech. Okay, we see the problem there indeed. Let me go on. I go on in great detail in my book with a lot of different quotes, with a lot of different analysis of all of this. Here is what one of the guidelines coming out of the IRS says. Now, they publish a document. It's called Publication 1828. It's the guidance for churches about political intervention. But let me point something out. The law is in the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code. The tax code is law. And that's where the Johnson Amendment resides. This amendment that was put in for personal political motives without legislative debate or history was put in there in 1954. That's law, but it's vague, as I already pointed out. That's the IRC. The IRS is an agency. Their publications are not law. They have a publication that tries to interpret and apply the Johnson Amendment, but the IRS publications are not law. The Internal Revenue Code is the law. IRS, it's an interpretation of the law. But here's what they say. Let me read this for you, just a portion of it. They're talking about voter education activities. And again, a 501c3 is supposed to conduct those activities. A church is supposed to conduct those activities in a nonpartisan way. Notice the law and the IRS does not say they shouldn't do it. It doesn't say you can't talk about elections. Nothing ever says anything like that. You don't talk about elections. You don't talk about voting. It doesn't say that. And yet this chilling effect often means that. It means that the word voting and the word elections doesn't ever come off their lips. That's wrong. It says that when you do voter education or even voter registration drives, how many churches do you know do voter registration drives? It says you haven't conducted in a nonpartisan way. And then it goes on to say this: on the other hand, voter education with evidence of bias that would favor one candidate over another or oppose a candidate in some manner, or have the effect, now listen carefully to these words, have the effect of favoring a candidate or a group of candidates, will constitute prohibited participation or intervention. First of all, this is just the interpretation of the law, so attorneys and all the rest of us are free to argue with this. Secondly, I refer you to the first thing I said tonight. We have a president who has already directed the IRS not to punish people, especially churches, for speaking out on political matters. Keeping all that in mind, I want to ask you how it's possible for the church to follow this advice. Now, and those of you who are clergy, I need you to think this through with me. Here you've got, if you take this at its word, okay, here you've got a prohibition against educating voters in such a way that your message has the overall effect of making people turn against a particular candidate or group of candidates. If a particular party, like the Republican Party declares that the unborn should be protected, and the Democrat Party says that they can be killed at any stage of pregnancy, and the church says the unborn child has to be protected, which is the same thing the Republican Party says, how can we faithfully teach the teachings of the church on something like abortion and not appear to discredit or be against the party of the Democrats? I want to know how you do that. Anybody have an answer for me? In other words, how can you possibly clearly and faithfully articulate the position of the church on an issue like this and not appear to be opposing Democrat candidates who are out there campaigning for the right to choose? The honest answer is it cannot be done. You can't follow this advice and remain true to your obligation to proclaim the teachings of the church. It cannot be done. It's not logically possible to do it. It's not logically possible to do it. And it's not according, therefore, to the church's teaching that I also quoted you at the beginning from the Second Vatican Council, saying that the church must carry out its task among men without hindrance and pass moral judgment, even in matters relating to politics, when it regards fundamental human rights. It is contradictory to the mission of the church to, on the one hand, say, oh yes, we have to be free to teach our message, and on the other hand say, oh, but in doing so, do not appear to favor or discredit any candidate or party. You cannot follow that advice. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it's about time that we all recognize that and say that. Now, sometimes the church tries to protect itself here by saying that, oh, well, you can only use voter education materials that are approved by the diocese or issued by the Bishops' Conference. Do you really think that the IRS, if they were to even try to act against the church, which, as I'm going to point out, they won't, but do you think that even the IRS is going to use as its criterion to figure out whether or not someone has broken the law in this matter, going to ask who issued the voter education material? Is that one of the criteria in IRS publication 1828 that gives the guidance? Does it say anything about whether the diocese issued it or the Bishops' Conference issued that particular voter guide? That's not the line of demarcation, my friends. That's not what it is. What the line of demarcation is very vague, but it has absolutely nothing to do with who issued the voter education materials. Now, let me give you an example of how this problem multiplies and deepens when we've got an inherently vague law, the Johnson Amendment, in the IRC, in the Internal Revenue Code, the tax code, made more vague by IRS interpretations of that law, talking about all the facts and circumstances as a standard. Now it gets made even worse when church agencies, dioceses, issue documents, issue memoranda saying to the pastors, oh, now you got to be careful when it comes to elections because you might make the whole church lose its tax exempt status. It makes it even worse. Let me read for you the guidelines that a particular diocese put out for policy guidelines about political activities. And I quote, websites sponsored by the diocese or affiliated organizations must be careful and diligent about not promoting or discrediting any political party or candidate. For example, a website promoting key issues for the church, such as the right to life and immigration reform, must avoid content or links that promote or discredit a particular party or candidate. It is clearly the policy of the diocese that neither it nor its employees will engage in any political activity which seeks to support or discredit any political party or candidate. Each incorporated parish would be wise to adopt this or a similar policy to avoid placing its tax-exempt status at risk. There's so many things wrong with this statement, I don't know where to begin. But let me begin by pointing out that I already said how vague it is when you look at the wording of the law itself, when it says you cannot intervene in a political campaign for or against a particular political candidate. Now that in itself is vague enough. But now you're not talking about those words. Now the words you're using are, you can't discredit a political party or candidate. Or you can't promote them either. So again, one party stands strongly for the right to life of the babies, like the church does. Another party stands strongly for the right to kill those babies. I'm supposed to be able to preach the teachings of the church and not discredit the Democrat Party, which is the party of abortion? How do you do that? I'd really like to know how you do that. Fact of the matter is you can't. Here's another diocese coming out with these unbelievable statements. Catholic organizations may educate voters about the issues. In addition, they may provide neutral educational forums or information on candidates' positions or make known the church's position on issues. Indeed, it is the church's right and obligation to make its teachings on moral ideas known, as long as these teachings do not run afoul of the rules on political activity. Did you hear that? It sounds so noble. It sounds like it's almost quoting the Gaudium et Spes passage that we just said. The church, let me read this again. This is a memo that came out from a diocese. The church's right and obligation to make its teachings on moral ideas known. Wow, that's an obligation that comes from Jesus Christ. That's an obligation that comes from the Great Commission. Go out and make disciples of all the nations. Yes, we have the obligation to do that. It's obedience to God, right? As long as these teachings do not run afoul of the rules on political activity. Wow. Here's something that comes from the USCCB. Quote, impermissible activity. Do not even appear to endorse or oppose particular candidates for public office or political parties. All right, let's put political candidates aside for a moment. And let's put aside endorse. Let's just consider this part of it. Do not even appear to oppose political parties. How do you articulate the teachings of the church and not even appear to oppose parties that oppose that teaching? Again, logically, it's impossible to do. Do not even appear to oppose. How do you preach the gospel and not appear to oppose those who attack the gospel? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Let's look at the Supreme Court again. There's a decision called Buckley versus Vallejo. Now here's a little bit of common sense. Let's listen to this, as opposed to these memos which don't have any common sense. The distinction between discussion of issues and candidates and advocacy of election or defeat of candidates may often dissolve in practical application. You can say that again. Candidates, especially incumbents, are often intimately tied to public issues involving legislative proposals and government actions. Not only do candidates campaign on the basis of their positions on various public issues, but campaigns themselves generate issues of public interest. In short, the supposedly clear-cut distinction between discussion, laudation, general advocacy, and solicitation puts the speaker in these circumstances wholly at the mercy of the varied understanding of his hearers. That's a good point. Again, the speaker, the preacher, how does he know how someone is going to interpret what he says as being an attack on a party or a candidate, even if he doesn't use any specific words about the party or the candidate? It's totally at the mercy of the hearers. Again, it's unfair from a legal perspective, not to mention ecclesiastical, that you put a burden on somebody, a prohibition on somebody, that they don't know where the line is and they can't control where the line is. Now, this is one of my favorites. This is another diocese that came out before one of our recent national elections and said this: use extreme caution with regard to any materials prepared by outside organizations. The IRS notes that the acts of outside organizations will be attributed to the churches if they either explicitly or implicitly allow the leafleting to take place. We're talking about leafleting in the parking lots, right, of political material. If they either explicitly or implicitly allow the leafleting to take place. Now, I can understand what explicitly allow means, because you get up and say that it's allowed, or you give a letter of permission to people to distribute flyers in the parking lot. But can any of you tell me what implicitly allow means? Think about it for a minute. Allow in and of itself is rather implicit or passive. It's like, I'm not doing something, I'm allowing you to do it. So how do I express that? Well, I can tell you that I allow you to do it, or I can implicitly allow you to do it, which means what? That I just say nothing? But this is saying you can't do that. Let me follow me again with this. The diocesan memo says you cannot explicitly allow the leafleting, okay, of political material. And then it goes on to say you cannot implicitly allow it. Maybe those of you that are pastors, I've never been a pastor. I am a priest, but I've never been a pastor. Maybe when you become a pastor, you get some kind of magical knowledge about what this is supposed to mean. How do you implicitly allow something? And then how do you not implicitly allow it? This boggles the mind. So if I implicitly allow it, it seems to me that that means somebody else is doing something, I know that they're doing it, and I don't say anything. So what is this telling the pastors to do? Call the police on people who are leafleting materials? Actually, that does happen. People contact me about this when it comes this time of year and people are trying to engage in this activity. Well, it's getting late, friends. Something we have to understand here is this. No church has ever lost its tax-exempt status because of any of this. And even though the IRS has at times investigated, and they've gone on campaigns, they investigated us, like I told you, or they've gone on campaigns and tried to enforce It's all bark, it's no bite. They never get to the point where they say, we're going to take away, we're removing your tax exemption permanently. Doesn't happen. It's never happened. With because of a sermon, because of a teaching in the bulletin, because of an article that was written, not even with an election campaign ad that a church put forward. There's a federal court case about that, and it said, hey, the church is still tax exempt. So I go back. First of all, you look at the history of this. I talked about the inherent vagueness of all of this. But you look at the history of this, the IRS is all bark and no bite. The bark is itself is vague, but then there's no bite. There's no punishment here that's ever happened. Add on top of that the fact that now the President of the United States has directed the IRS not to suppress, inhibit, or punish political speech. What are we saying? We're not saying that the church should become a political party. I'm not saying that in the parish we start taking up collections for somebody's political campaign. I'm saying we speak, and the President is saying, we are to speak freely what we believe the Word of God is saying about the issues of the day and about how they apply to politics and elections. And that means nobody is to try to tell us that we can't point out which is the pro-life party, that we can't point out that any public servant who doesn't know the difference between serving the public and killing the public should not be in public office, that we should not point out that if a politician can't respect the life of a little baby, how is he or she supposed to respect yours, life, and mine? We are to be free and we are to be clear in what we teach and preach, and the churches have to stop interfering with the rights of their parishioners to inform their fellow parishioners about the candidates, the parties, and the election issues. Let me conclude then by again reading these words from the President of the United States as he issued an executive order over a year and a half ago now, about this Johnson Amendment. And I quote, "No American should be forced to choose between the dictates of the federal government and the tenets of their faith. As I campaigned across the country, faith leaders explained that they are prevented from speaking their minds because of a 1954 rule known as the Johnson Amendment. I spoke about it a lot. Under this rule, if a pastor, priest, or imam speaks about issues of public or political importance, they are threatened with the loss of their tax-exempt status, a crippling financial punishment. Very, very unfair, but no longer. This executive order directs the IRS not to unfairly target churches and the religious community for political speech. No one should be censoring sermons or targeting pastors. In America, we do not fear people speaking freely from the pulpit. We embrace it. America has a rich tradition of social change beginning in our pews and pulpits. Under my administration, this free speech does not end at the steps of the cathedral or synagogue or any other house of worship. We are giving our churches their voices back. We are giving them back in the highest form. With this executive order, we make clear that the federal government will never, ever penalize any person for their protected religious beliefs. That is why I am today directing the Department of Justice to develop new rules to ensure these religious protections are afforded to all Americans. And as I always say, the best way to protect our freedoms is to exercise them, use them. Friends, whether you're clergy or laity, speak up as we enter into this one of the most important midterm elections we have ever had. Speak your mind. Speak it loud, speak it clear. Speak it from the pulpit, speak it from your kitchen table, speak it online, speak it in your email, on your social media, proclaim it on the streets. You can be sure I'll never keep quiet, and I thank you for joining me in that very same attitude. God bless you. Thanks for listening to me. Get my book, Abolishing Abortion. You get it at abolishingabortion.com. You'll see all the study in here of all these situations and applications with the Johnson Amendment. Let's make a change, brothers and sisters. Let's move forward and let's make America great once again. Father Frank Pavone here of Priests for Life. Join me again tomorrow. I will be live with you at 10 in the morning and then again for our 9 p.m. broadcast. God bless you.